Hi everybody! In today's video, we're going to be going through the notes for lesson 1.5, which is about function notation. Now, here's what we're talking about when I say function notation. Up until now, we have always been writing our ordered pairs in what is called ordered pair notation. The key features of ordered pair notation is that there's going to be a parentheses, and the x coordinate is always going to be first, so it's going to be on the left, and the y coordinate is always going to be second, so it's always going to be on the right. And that's how we show which x's and y's are paired together. That's why it's called ordered pair. Today we're going to be writing the same information in a different notation. So our goal is still to show which x's and which y's are paired together, but instead of using ordered pair notation, we're going to write it a different way. Function notation looks a little bit different. Instead of having a parentheses, you're going to have a name of a function. So function notation has a name. For example, in this example I'm giving you, the function is called f. Now, just like there's an x and a y in our ordered pair notation, in our function notation, there's always going to be a parentheses after the name, which is in this case f, but we can use whatever letter we want. There's always going to be a parentheses, and inside of the parentheses is always going to be where we put the x. Then there's going to be an equal sign, and after the equal sign is going to be where we write the y. It's always after the equal sign. So the first thing we're going to do before we do anything else is practice taking ordered pair notation and writing it in function notation so that you can see it's really the same thing but two different ways to write it. For example, we have a table here where we have x is our input and our output is g of x, which tells us that the name of our function is g. Now we also have x numbers on the left side of the table, and we have y numbers on the right side of the table. What we're going to do is we're going to take these exact same numbers and we're going to write them in function notation. So here's how that would look. They're telling me in these directions that the name of my function is g. So g is going to be the first thing that I write down for my function notation. Now, after the name of the function, you're always going to have a parentheses and an equals. Inside the parentheses, we put our x numbers. So since the x number of the first ordered pair is -3, it would go inside. -1, 1, and 3. And outside is where we put our y numbers. So after the equal sign, we put the 4, the 9, the 14, and the 19. Now this just again means that here's my x and here's my y, but we're just giving this relationship a name, this function a name called g. Let's do the same thing, but let's do it with points from a graph. Now, the easiest way to do this is going to be to start by writing the points the normal way that we write points. So I'm going to have two things in this box. I'm going to have a parentheses to write my normal points with a comma. And then below there, I'm going to go ahead and write in my function notation for the same points. For point A, the x coordinate is -4. And the y coordinate is +4. For point B, the x-coordinate is -1 and the y-coordinate is +4. For point C, the x-coordinate is 0 and the y-coordinate is 2. For point D, the x-coordinate is 1 and the y-coordinate is 0. For point E, the x-coordinate is 2 and the y-coordinate is -2. And for point F, the x-coordinate is 4 and the y-coordinate is -1. Now, if I read the directions here, it says write the points of the graph of f of x in function notation. So it's telling me that the name of this function, this graph, is f. That means that my function notation is going to start with f every single time because the name of your function goes first. Then we're going to have a parentheses and an equals. Parentheses and an equals. Now the x-coordinate always goes inside the parentheses, so -4, -1, 0, 1, 2, and 4. And the y-coordinate always goes after the equal sign. And as you can see, it kind of aligns with where we put our x's and our y's in our parentheses, our ordered pair notation. X is first, y is second. Now, the reason this notation is super important is because we use it to sort of indicate that we might be missing a number. For example, we're going to be using function notation to find missing values. That means one of the numbers, either the x or the y, is going to be missing. And your job is going to be to find the missing number. So here are the 2 steps you need to follow. First, you need to determine, which means to decide, whether the number that you know, whether the number you're given is an x or a y. So you're going to know either an x or a y. You're going to know you have an x if it's inside the parentheses. And you're going to know you have a y if it's after the equal sign. Once you understand and you decide what number you know, then your job is to find the number you don't know. So for example, in this first example, we know the x because it's inside the parentheses. What we're trying to figure out is the y. For the second example here, we know the y because it's after the equal sign. So what we're trying to figure out here is the x. What you need to do is look at whether the number that you see is inside of the parentheses or outside of the parentheses. And that's how you'll know whether you know the x or the y. So we're going to use function notation to find some missing numbers. Let's do a few examples. In the first example, the number that I see is inside of the parentheses, which means I'm going to label that x. That also means that the number I'm looking for is y. So on my table, I'm going to go find the number 0 in the x column, which is right here. The corresponding number that goes with that from the y column is 2, so that's my answer. In the next problem, the 4 is on the inside of the parentheses, so that's an x, which means I'm going to look for the number 4 in the left column, and I'm going to match it up with the number in the right column. That's the y. For problem number 3, you can see that the 0 is actually outside of the parentheses. So this time I know the y and I need to figure out the x, which means I'm going to go look for that number in the y column. The 0 is here, so the corresponding x would be 3. And last but not least, in the next problem, in problem number 4, the 3 is after the equal sign, so that's the y, and I need to go back and find the x. So I'm going to look for the number 3 in the y column. Now you're going to notice there are actually 2 number 3s there. That means there are going to be 2 corresponding x values. The first one is 1 and the second one is 5. So I'm going to list them both. So when you're working with a table, don't forget that the x's are always the left and the y's are always the right, which means if you know an x, you look for it in the x and write down the y. And if you know a y, you look for it in the y and you write down the x. Now let's do an example with a graph. Now, as a quick reminder, on a graph, the x numbers are always here on the x-axis, and the y numbers are always here on the y-axis. So, first example. This number 0 is inside of the parentheses, which means it's an x. That means I'm going to find the 0 on the x-axis, and I'm going to look up or down to find the corresponding point on the graph. In this case, the y value of that point is the number 1, and I'm done. For the next one, the -2 is inside the parentheses, so that's an x, which means I'm going to look for the -2 on the x-axis. Now I'm going to look up or down to figure out where the point is that lines up with that number. And the y value of that point is -3. It gets a little trickier sometimes when we're looking for the opposite. So in this next example for problem 3, the y is -2. That means I'm going to find the -2 on the y-axis, and I'm going to look to the left and look to the right. It looks like there are 2 points that line up with that level of the graph. The first one, the x-coordinate is -3, and the second one, the x-coordinate is -1. Last but not least, for the 6 here, that's a y value because it's on the outside of the parentheses. It's after the equal sign. The 6 would be right up here. I'm going to look to the left and I'm going to look to the right. And once again, there are 2 points that line up with that. So I'm going to write down their x values. The x values are -5 and +1. Last but not least, let's talk about interpreting. Interpreting in math means using labels to tell what each value represents in a story. So what we're going to do is we're going to find our missing numbers, x's and y's, but then we're going to interpret those results, so tell what those numbers mean in a story. For example, in problem number 1, we have a table here where the x's are minutes and the y's are heights. If I said to you, find h of 15, the 15 is inside the parentheses, so that's an x. That means I'm going to look for that number in the x column of the table. The corresponding y value is 10. Now I'm going to interpret. I'm going to go back to my labels. In the directions here, it said that the x values were the minutes, so I'm going to label that. And it said that the y numbers were the feet. that means that our interpretation will look something like this. After 15 minutes, the height was 10 feet. So for each of the numbers, the 15 and the 10, we've used labels to identify what those numbers meant in the story. Let's try problem number 2. If g of x is equal to 30, then what does x equal? Well, since the 30 is after the equal sign, that's a y value, which means I'm going to find that number somewhere over here. This is the 30. Now I'm going to look to the left and look to the right, and I can see that there are 2 places where the graph lines up with the 30. The first place is when x is 2, and the second place is when x is 8. Now I'm going to interpret. Based on the labels, the x's represent the days since being paid. So I'm going to label that x is the days since being paid. And the y corresponds to the amount of money in your account. So my interpretation is going to look something like this. After 2 and 8 days, because there were 2 places this happened, there was $30 in the account. And that's it. Thank you all so much for watching, and this is a good time to start your homework.